Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Surita, and I'll be talking to you guys today about biosecurity and hopefully help you guys on the way to develop your own plan for your horse property, or whether you're involved with horse events. So just a bit of background information about me. I am an equine medicine clinician at the Equine Health and Performance Centre at the University of Adelaide's Roseworthy campus, where I started in May 2018, and I oversee the hospital's biosecurity processes. So this is a topic that that's close to heart. I graduated from the University of Pretoria in South Africa in 2007, where after I worked in equine private practice for about 6 years before starting my specialist training at Charles Sturt University in Wagga Wagga. I then proceeded to do my board examinations in 2018 to become a registered specialist in equine medicine. So hopefully I'll be able to take you through today. We'll talk about a couple of things, overviewing biosecurity, and then we'll move on to a more structured plan to help you develop a biosecurity plan, essentially. So I've provided you with a couple of websites that I found quite useful in getting some resources that Julie will make available to everyone as well, and they're really good websites, local sites that will help you develop your plan. So the aim of today, like I said, is to develop a biosecurity plan for horse events, but a lot of the things we'll be talking about we can generalize to horse venues as well. So whether you've got an adjustment centre, just your own property with occasional visiting horses, or a large stable yard of race horses, these things are all applicable to you. So what is biosecurity? It can be described as the management and individual hygiene practices that minimise the movement of disease onto or off of a property, but also within a venue. Contaminants are kind of thought of substances that are present in or on feed and feed ingredients that might pose a risk to your horse's health. A fomite is any inanimate object that might contribute to disease distribution, so things like equipment, vehicles, objects, clothing, etc. When we talk about biosecurity and a plan today, when I refer to manager, it's essentially the person responsible for the daily management of the husbandry of the horses on your property or site. And SOP is standard operating procedure, and the venue is any place that is frequented by horses. So like I said, this includes horse establishments, properties where horse events can occur, or even things like thinking about beaches where horses often congregate for rides. So the Farm Biosecurity website is really useful, and they've also got an app that you can download that will be really useful. There's another equine specific app, Equi Bio Safe, that's produced by the Horse Levy Board in the UK. So some of the specific examples on that app is obviously based around things that should or should not be done in the UK and rules and regulations, but there's a lot of generic information in there that's really useful. And the good thing about using apps is that we've all got our phones with us, and it's a handy reference tool when you're out in the field. So the aim essentially of biosecurity is to reduce the risk of disease spread from an infected horse to others. It's to prevent disease spread from an infected area to an uninfected area, or even to humans in the case of zoonotic diseases. So not only will it prevent disease spread, like we just said, but it's also part of our responsibility under the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement as an equine industry. It will protect your livelihood if you think about the potential repercussions of a large outbreak, what that could do to your property and your business, for example. And in addition, I've been told that Equestrian Australia will make it official requirements that all horse events need to have a biosecurity plan in place before their event can continue. This will happen at some point, so the idea about this webinar is to try and help you guys on your way. So, biosecurity should be an integral part of the management of any horse venue. It refers to the measures taken to prevent or control the introduction and spread of infectious agents to horses. It's about managing risk to meet those objectives. It obviously needs to be site-specific or venue-specific and can vary greatly depending on multiple factors, such as the design of your property or the site, the management, costs associated with implementing these procedures, and the climate. As such, the acronym PEX is used by the Animal Health Australia, and it essentially helps to remind you that the measures that you think about and want to potentially use in your biosecurity plan have to be practical, they have to be effective in what you're going to use them for. They have to be affordable. We can't do everything gold standard if we can't afford it. Obviously, the venue has to have the capacity as well as the staff to implement the measure that you want to employ, and then the measures have to be sustainable for it to be functional. So we're talking about biosecurity, and ultimately the whole idea behind it, like we said, is to prevent the spread and introduction of disease. So how does disease transmission occur? Well, the easy and obvious thing is between horses. So spread of disease can occur between horses within a venue, but also between horses from one venue to another when there's movement of horses. This can occur because of direct contact between horses, but also by indirect contact between horses, such as with shared water troughs or fomites, like I said before. It can also occur because of inadequate or inappropriate disposal of dead animals. Other animals, such as domestic animals, including livestock and pets, dogs and cats, can spread disease between horses. Flying foxes, obviously, pests, birds, wild as well as domestic, can spread disease. People play a big role in spreading disease, and when we think of people that may spread disease within a venue, this may be personnel living there, family members living on site, people that visit the property, such as contractors, maintenance personnel, vets, neighbours, anyone that enters the property. And then disease can obviously be carried on your hands, your boots, clothing, your hair even, and even in the respiratory tract if we think about disease transmission from humans to horses. Vehicles and equipment can also play a role in disease and pathogen transmission. So things like tack, feeding and water equipment, rugs can easily play a role in disease transmission. Tyres and the undercarriage of vehicles, horse floats and horse trucks are, can play a big role, especially if those trucks and floats, for example, might do multiple pickups. Diseases, certain diseases can also be transmitted through the air or as particle or aerosol, so that should also be considered when you're developing an isolation or quarantine area, for example. Feed can be contaminated, and this can occur either by contamination of the raw materials during feed production, either during transport or exposure to rodents and pests, for example, when feeds are being stored. Feed can also be contaminated by bacterial mold growth if they're being stored incorrectly, for example. Water sources can become contaminated by feces from horses or other animals, and then we also should think about pests and weeds as potential causes of disease. So before we move on to working through the farm biosecurity workbook that Julie's provided to you guys, I think we can look at the Equestrian Queensland biosecurity policy, and we can learn a fair bit from them. So just a bit of background, their competitors are asked to ensure that good biosecurity practices are implemented at home and at the event, and that following the instructions of the organising committee and the biosecurity manager is paramount and is a rule. And if they don't do what they're meant to do, expulsion from the event might be a repercussion. All horses entering the grounds must be from a property actively participating in good biosecurity principles, and all horses have to have a horse health declaration as a mandatory requirement. This horse health declaration form, which I'm going to try and show you guys, requests a variety of information, as you can see on this form, and it includes identification information such as microchip number, brands, markings, etc. It also wants information about the vaccination status for Queensland, specifically Hendra virus, but also consideration of tick lines, etc. And people have to fill in the PIC code and identifying information for all the horses that may move onto or off of the property. The property identification code of the horse's origin must also be included, like I said, in this horse health declaration form, and other biosecurity and workplace health and safety measures that aim to provide us the safest environment for the horses, competitors and volunteers include that horses or dogs with signs of illness are not allowed to be brought onto the grounds of any horse event. So signs of illness, you might think of things like nasal discharge, coughing, fever, altered manure consistency. It doesn't have to be really sinister. Anything like that might mean that your horse won't be allowed to enter or attend the event. There will be no communal horse water troughs available at their events. Competitors are instructed not to share equipment, including food and water containers, between horses. Competitors are responsible for cleaning up their own manure from the yards and placing it in a designated area, and must use their own rakes or shovels. Equally, they also are required to advise the organisers if a horse becomes sick, and to make sure that no one comes into contact with that horse, especially children. And then everyone handling horses should wash and sanitize their hands between contacting different horses, and that's something that I think can often easily be overlooked. Additional tips that I would suggest to think about when you're thinking about developing your own biosecurity plan would be things like requesting maintenance of a rectal temperature log, for example, taking daily rectal temperatures for 1 to 2 weeks prior to an event. I know that some endurance organisations already do that, including in the horse health declaration form vaccination records, so making vaccinations against certain diseases a prerequisite. Now that will depend on what type of property you have, whether it's a horse event or whether you're just thinking about your own property. So for example, strangles vaccination, you might want to make that a prerequisite that people have vaccinated their horse within the last 6 months, or that they've had a serological test to show that the horse has got protection. Other vaccinations that you might want to make mandatory include Hendra virus, especially if you've got horses from interstate, for example, or equine herpes virus vaccinations if you have a stud farm and brood mares moving onto and off of your property, for example. If you do decide to implement something like a temperature log and vaccination record, then it's important to verify that this has occurred, so that people know that this is an actual rule that they have to follow. And then we need to limit or have no direct contact between horses from different properties when we're on at horse venues. Additional rules that Queensland enforce include that horses need to be shampooed, rinsed and dried, and their feet cleaned prior to being loaded on the float, and that all horse transport vehicles need to be cleaned and disinfected prior to departure to an event. And I think those are basic rules that really could make a big difference. So before starting, I guess from a practical perspective, it'll be useful for you guys to get an aerial map of your venue showing roads and entrances, exits, etc. Get something that's clear that you can scribble on to make plans, and also obviously have handy anything, any existing documentation. So there's a 3-step process. It's a bit more than that ultimately, but step 1 takes you through every single little thing that we need to think of. There may be specific examples that I won't cover, but it's a pretty comprehensive document. So to get started, you need to set your goals. You need to, in your mind, decide what is the important thing for your either horse event or your venue. And then you work your way through each section of this tool, the Farm Biosecurity tool, and select statements that kind of for your current management reflect what you should be doing or what you are doing at the moment. And then you want to summarize what you've done, and then we rank the actions and that need to be taken, and then start by those that are ranked as high importance, or those that haven't been addressed at all. So step 1, like I said, we need to decide what's our aim. So on this page, the biosecurity document, the farm biosecurity plan document, gives you the opportunity to list what your aims are in relation to horse biosecurity and horse health, essentially. And then step 1.1 essentially is to minimise the risk of disease or contamination introduction by the movement of horses and other animals, in brackets obviously, onto or off of your venue. So general considerations, apologies, any horses that return to the venue from an event should be seen as a potential disease risk. So this means horses that have gone to the races, showing, or have left the property just for breeding need to be considered as a potential disease risk. So ideally, new or returning or visiting horses should be separate from resident horses, so quarantined or isolated for at least 10 days. And these horses should have their temperatures checked at least twice a day to make sure that they're not harbouring disease or that there's no sign of disease. This quarantine time will allow signs of illness to emerge if there is anything like that. And by quarantining these horses, we're preventing spread of disease to the rest of the population. So if we think about horses that compete and move a lot, it might just be more practical to actually group these horses together away from resident horses that do not travel. Might also be useful at this stage to think about vaccination records and vaccination protocols. If horses enter the property or show obvious signs of disease, you can, if you're at a horse venue, for example, or an event, you might decide not to allow that horse to be offloaded from the float. Or if you're at a property and it's one of your horses returning or a new horse to your adjustment property, then you would need to implement immediate quarantine and hygiene or isolation procedures. So that involves things like separate equipment for the sick horses and dealing with sick horses last, for example. Horses that are sick or suspected of being sick should always be handled by separate personnel, or they should be seen at the end of the day, like I said. And these horses should not be moved within the property or off of the property unless it's for veterinary treatment. And then when you're moving sick horses within the venue, it is important to minimise contact with other horses. Now, even though we're thinking about sick horses right now, that also implies for horses that are not showing any overt signs of any illness. Then coming back to something I mentioned before, horses of different types should be housed together. So you shouldn't let different groups mix. So when I say that, I mean, for example, on a big stud farm, you want to have your Brood mares and foals separate to those mares that may have travelled to properties to being bred. You want to have your young stock separate from your yearlings and 2-year-olds, and then separate again from horses that are competing, and those should be separate again from resident horses that do not travel. So you really want to have horses in small groups, physically separated as practically as possible. You also want to ensure that health practices are not only applied to the horses but also other animals on the property, so dogs and cats, and making sure that dogs and cats especially don't have access to your quarantine or isolation facilities, as they can easily transmit diseases from one area to another. So when we're thinking about horse event and venue managers specifically, what can we think about, or what should we think about? We should consider that all horses entering the event grounds are known and recorded. So this includes lead ponies or that companion pony that comes in with another horse. All these horses need to be identified and should have accompanying health declarations of some description with them. Stables, yards and paddocks of resident horses on your property or venue should be separate from those of visiting horses. We should evaluate horses preferably at the time of arrival before they're offloaded to confirm their identification, to check their travel records. This includes their health records, their vaccination records, etc. To check them for signs of good or ill health, so looking for evidence of respiratory disease like nasal discharge or coughing, fever, or signs of diarrhea like a soiled tail or soft or watery feces in a float. Horse venues should also enforce rules for refusing entry of unhealthy horses. So if you state in your documents that you're going to do it, you should do it. That's the only way to prevent disease introduction to your property. And also ensure that other animals that are entering your venue, whether it's for a competition or part of a show, such as sheep, cattle, goats, etc., also have biosecurity principles that need to be adhered to. When we're thinking about travel considerations and movement of horses, it's always a good idea to ensure that horses have limited stress prior to travel, so we can help them along their way by ensuring that they're in good body condition, no evidence of illness, that they're fed and watered before the journey. If a horse is suspected of being unwell or has come into contact with a sick horse, that horse probably should be moved to a quarantine area, and you should try and delay or modify your travel plans until that horse is fit to travel. Then it's also important to promote to your staff and competitors that all horses should be clean of any physical or visible dirt, weeds, seeds, etc. prior to entering or exiting venues. Should always avoid mixing different animals during transport, and try and engage transport companies that have quality assurance programs in place. So this form comes from that workbook, and there's some examples in there. Julie's uploaded that for you guys on the website as well. So at this stage, if you're working on a biosecurity plan, you want to think about and complete the form. Think about things that you currently do for managing horse health on your property, and what you can potentially do to improve horse health management on your property or venue. The next step is to think about how we can minimise the risk of disease or contaminant introduction by movement of vehicles and equipment, feed and bedding onto or off of the venue. So general considerations is that we should think about where parking areas are. We should have designated specific areas for parking for visitors and contractors, and encourage them to report to a central area, so having a bell or a device that they can attract your attention with. This kind of becomes a control point and avoids people from wandering into areas that they shouldn't have gone into. You should also try and avoid parking areas or Avoid having parking areas close to horse traffic areas, again, so that we limit the risk of disease spread by contamination, for example. It's also good practice to ensure that deliveries are made close to the venue boundary, or that you have designated travel routes for delivery. So things like feed and bedding should ideally be delivered directly to a space or an area close to the boundary of your property, rather than in the middle where the truck has to go right past the paddocks where horses move around in regularly. In the ideal situation, staff should also have dedicated work boots and clothing on site to avoid potential transfer contaminants from outside the venue. Aisles and stable areas should be kept clean with no manure, bedding or urine present to limit transfer of contamination again. Equipment such as tooth rasps, twitches, halters, etc., stomach tubes should be disinfected between each horse, and consider having dedicated equipment for different groups of horses as well. Promote to the staff and your competitors that requirement for clean vehicles to make sure that if your staff are adhering to those regulations, the competitors will follow suit because they know those are the rules. And then again, just selecting contractors and suppliers with quality assurance programs in place. Then when we're thinking about horse events and venues, more specifically, again, separate horse entering points for the venue for resident horses compared to competition horses, making sure that equipment, including feed and water containers, are not shared. Make sure you also have a feed policy to try and minimise the introduction of weeds or contaminants to your property. We need to try and promote a clean venue, so we want to encourage competitors to follow a standard of cleanliness before, during and after the stay at the venue, so encouraging them to clean up after themselves. Avoid using communal water troughs, and if equipment has to be shared, you want to assess the risk of that piece of equipment and potentially think about how we can reduce the risk. So something like a measuring bay, a weigh bay, for example, would be considered to be a low risk, but something like a twitch would be considered to be a high risk piece of equipment on a property, for example. So this form, again, you could fill in with your current management of vehicles, equipment, feed and bedding, and also think about how you could improve on these aspects of biosecurity. So the third objective of step 1 is to minimise the risk of disease or contaminant introduction through the movement of people. So like I said before, when we think about people and disease spread, this includes visitors, but also includes personnel and their family. It includes unexpected visitors, people that might be coming onto the property to collect manure, for example, for their garden, or someone that drives into your property accidentally. We need to think about ways of minimising biosecurity breaks as much as possible. We need to promote property hygiene practices to all people, and we can only do this by using signage. And again, Biosecurity Queensland have some nice signs that are useful to use at horse events, for example, like this one put up at the gates, washing hands, to remind people that at every washing station that you should be washing your hands before you touch another horse if you've been touching a horse, and then just the kind of reminder of the general rules and regulations. When we're thinking about farm biosecurity on a property, your own property, for example, this type of sign would be very useful to place at all your entry gates so that people know who to contact before they come in, so that they're aware there are biosecurity rules and regulations that should be followed, and before they enter, they could contact this number. So like I said, we want to promote hygiene, and we want to think about restricting visitor access to areas of the farm especially. So you might have general access to certain portions of your property, but definitely restrict access to isolation or quarantine areas to people that generally have to be there. So vets, for example, that really have to come and see this ill horse. You also want to manage horse contact with each other, so horse to horse contact, but also with feed, manure or other wastes. You need to make sure that you've got hand washing facilities near your isolation areas, at areas where horses arrive and are loaded up, anywhere where husbandry and procedural areas are, so that we can make sure or try and encourage good hand hygiene as much as possible. And you obviously want to install signage so that people are made aware. For isolation or quarantine areas, things to consider include provision of foot baths, having separate footwear or disposable protective footwear that people can place over their own boots. You might want to think about having protective clothing as well. And then naturally, you also have to have a hand washing area wherever your quarantine bay or quarantine facilities are. When we think about horse venues, again, competition events, you need to, as a manager, think about trying to keep people that are not associated with the horses separate from the horses, so spectators. Think about when you're going to the races, for example, spectators can be close to the horses, but generally they're not allowed to actually touch them. And this can be facilitated with the use of having separate entry points, having signage, and perhaps having people directing spectators to the correct areas. You want to provide information to your competitors to discourage them from entering stables or stalls of horses from other venues, especially when you're at a venue such as showgrounds or the sales, for example. This is not only competitors, but also applies to other people, such as veterinarians or anyone, the farrier that might need to visit multiple horses. You want to make sure that there are rules and perhaps someone to guide them along the biosecurity processes from moving from one horse to the next. You should identify all tasks that take place on the venue requiring horse-to-horse contact and take measures to try and eliminate the risk. For example, hand washing and washing of equipment in between horses, for example. And again, making sure that you provide hand washing facilities and provide appropriate signage. This is a sheet for managing of people and people movement. So again, on the sheet, you want to try and fill it in with what you're doing at the moment and what are the steps that you can take to improve the management of people and minimizing disease spread or the risk of disease spread by people. Then step 1.4 thinks about the venue design attributes and how we can think about designing a venue if you have that luxury to minimize the spread of disease or contaminants. So when we're thinking about venue design, you want to obviously avoid both permanent and temporary horse venues. You want to avoid swampy areas, anywhere that's near a bat colony or intensive piggeries. And this is to try and reduce the risk of cross-contamination. You want to include isolation or quarantine areas for sick horses. And these areas need to have their own feed and waste areas separate from the general feed and waste areas. You should have separate areas for treatment. So when a veterinarian has to come and visit the property for whatever reason, that should be separate again from your isolation and your general population. And then entrance restriction is really important as well. Ensure your perimeter fence is secure, and this can be done by having double fencing or boundary roadways, and the idea is to prevent nose-to-nose contact between horse groups, but also between other livestock and horses on your property with horses from the neighbouring property. Horse wash areas and other areas such as sand rolls and walkers should be designed to try and avoid contact between horses. And you have to have rules in place if these are communal areas for multiple horses to use, such as exclusion of horses from rolls or sand rolls or walkers that have skin conditions or nasal discharge or coughing or diarrhea. Those horses are not allowed to use those facilities until they're healthy or don't have any of these signs. Horse entry should also be minimised to only a few points so that you can manage the traffic and you know what's going on. Then when we're thinking about venue design and the structures per se, if you have control or you're in the process of developing a horse property, you might want to consider erecting stables or yards that have solid floors and walls that can easily be disinfected. You want to ensure that they've got good ventilation and that we've got standard operating procedures in place for regular cleaning and disinfection. Sanitation or disinfection includes the removal of all the organic material, so manure, feed, bedding, etc. Washing it, perhaps power hosing it with hot water and detergent, and then following that with a disinfectant. And that should really be done quite regularly on properties with large numbers of horses. You should also give consideration to stable access for mechanical equipment if you've got the luxury of planning a new property. Venue design should also feature gates or systems to separate certain sections of the venue, so not only the boundary but also to try and establish control points within your venue. You want to install designated travel corridors and parking areas like we talked about earlier, and you also want to have designated areas for horses to move in that's not used for vehicle traffic, for example. When developing your facilities, you should always consider waste management, and this includes heavy rain and flooding, for example. So wastes also include uneaten feed, soiled bedding, manure, medical waste, just general rubbish and water runoff from wash bays, for example. You obviously have to comply with state or local regulatory requirements for the management of wastewater, and water courses on your property should also be considered within your plans to avoid contamination. This page will help you to think about how to design your property or how to make improvements to your property, so you can fill in what you've already got in place and what steps you can take to improve your venue. And like I said, these biosecurity steps do not have to be expensive. They might just be something small that you can change to the venue and the way it works to try and improve your biosecurity principles. Then the next step is to think about management of feral and domestic animals and pests, and implementing specific management practices. So we need to identify which pests might be a problem on your property, and these includes rodents, feral cats, for example. Dogs might be a problem, even birds. An integrated pest and animal control program should be in place to deter those pests, and we want to obviously keep feed in rodent-proof containers. You want to avoid keeping horses, feed or equipment used for horses in areas that might be contaminated by bats or other pests. For example, rodents and other wildlife such as rabbits can shed a disease called leptospirosis that can cause pretty severe disease in younger horses. Bats spread Lissa virus as well as Hendra virus, both that are zoonotic. And birds, and specifically parrots, spread chlamydia psittaci or psittacosis. That is, again, a zoonosis, so a disease that can affect humans. So that's only to name a few if we're thinking about pests and wildlife, for example. We want to ensure that your isolation or quarantine areas are separate, obviously, like we said before, and that you have to provide separate coveralls, rubber boots and gloves for handlers. You want to keep the protective clothing in that area. It's not to leave the area, and obviously you have to provide hand washing facilities within your quarantine space. You need to establish some sort of work schedule for staff or volunteers that are involved with your quarantine areas, and making sure that they don't also handle your other resident horses, or if they do, that they're handling the horses that are in the isolation or quarantine area last. You need to make sure that you always have medical waste containers available, sharps containers available, if it is a space where a veterinarian might be working or where you might be treating that animal as well. Your venue waste management policy might also consider how you move, collect and store the waste that comes from your general property, but also from your isolation facilities. And waste from isolation areas need to be kept in such a way so that we can make sure its disease cannot potentially be spread by flies or through water contamination, for example. And then again, when you're thinking about waste disposal, you want to ensure that you select contractors and suppliers who have quality assurance programs in place. So not only for waste, but also for dead livestock. You will need to dispose of them appropriately to minimise contamination of your watercourses or water tables, soil, and also prevent access of wild animals to those animals. As a venue manager for a horse event, you need to have, in the unlikely events of a deceased animal, you do need to have a designated stock disposal option in place. You also need to consider how to get rid of waste. So when we think about waste, just like on properties, we're thinking about manure and bedding, general waste, but also water that comes from wash bays and truck washing facilities. So this form, again, is for you to collect your thoughts about how we can improve your management when we think about pests, wastes, and dead stock disposal. So think about things that you already do and how can we improve those processes. This step 1.6 is about record keeping, and it's good records will help you to detect horse health issues earlier on. So you want to develop, obviously, this biosecurity plan that we're talking about, and then you need to regularly review your response plan. So it's important to not only have the plan, but we need to make sure that what we do is recorded. So we need to make sure that we keep or at least cite health and travel records for each horse that moves onto or off of the property, but also moves within the property. Keeping internal movement records is essential, especially on large horse properties. You want to keep feed, bedding and veterinary drugs and delivery records. You need to document any horse coming onto or off of your property to the point where you can identify them. Where did they come from and where have they gone to on your property? Where practical, it's probably also a good idea to have visitor records. This will help you to determine what risk that visitor might pose to the biosecurity of your property, and also in the unlikely events of something happening, it will improve your ability to trace back to potentially where that disease comes from. Venues should have enforced minimum requirements for health statuses like vaccinations, like we talked about already, and you should always make sure that policies are adhered to for dogs and other visiting animals as well. Something to consider as well when we're thinking about records is obviously that records should be organised and easily accessed and updated and backed up regularly. So things to consider would be how to store your data and how can you improve your access so that multiple people have access to it. So in this day and age, there are many IT options. Rather than having the traditional paper records, having a central database probably makes more sense. For venue managers, so people thinking about horse events, you want to obviously develop and regularly review your emergency disease response and biosecurity plan. And these plans also involve those policies for postponing or cancelling events. And it's important that those are regularly checked so that it's not something that so that you don't actually only look at it when you need to use it. You want to make sure that you cite the health and travel records of each horse that come onto your property, as we've said before. You want to record their identity, where have they come from and where are they going. And you preferably want to have their health information on your entry forms as well. You want to ensure that movement records are linked to industry databases. Now that's not, unfortunately, always possible, but there are many industry databases that we can try and work with. So this form, again, same as before, will help you to consolidate what you're already doing and then what can you do to improve your management when it comes to record keeping. Then we need to think about staff and volunteer training. So all staff, including new employees, should always be trained with regards to the horse health practices and biosecurity practices of each property. Your staff should be provided with ongoing training opportunities to make sure that their skills are updated when it comes to disease prevention, disease identification, and what they can do to control disease spread. And training doesn't have to be expensive, like we said in the beginning. It might simply include mentoring or focus groups, workshops, online or self-directed training, for example. Training can also include sessions involving volunteers in the development of standard operating procedures, for example, or reviewing workplace safety practices, or the provision of information to other people, for example. So there are multiple avenues through which you can expand on your existing staff's training. And then again, we need to keep records of the training that has taken place. When we think about horse event venues, we need to ensure that not only our permanent staff or temporary officially paid staff are trained, but also that our officials and our volunteers are trained in the biosecurity principles and rules and regulations of the property and the event. We want to ensure that people are informed of the horse health practices. This pertains to the entry to the venue, for example, as well as closing of gates or only having horses and spectators in designated areas, etc. So simple things, but if you don't train people in those procedures, then they won't be aware. You want to ensure that you always have signage and information promoting your horse health practices. So again, I sound like a broken record, but hand washing, not sharing tack and water troughs, limiting contact between horses, disposing of your own waste, for example, sticking to designated movement areas, keeping spectators separate from competitors, etc. So on this sheet, we can think about what training you currently have in place and what can you do to improve the training of all people involved with your horse venue. The next and final objective of the first step is to minimise the risk of disease and contaminant introduction by providing information and infrastructure that promotes horse health and biosecurity. So what does that mean? Just like I said before, it essentially includes things such as gate signage, which will inform visitors that horse health or biosecurity is taken seriously on your venue. You want to use signage to restrict entry. You want to encourage hand washing, to close gates, or to trigger certain standard operating procedures. How to improve communication within your property or between staff? Well, you can easily do that by putting your biosecurity action plan in the staff room, tea room, for example, by putting it on notice boards, you know, by having information sent sessions, by posting it on social media. There are endless methods of promoting your biosecurity plan for your horse event or your venue. So the key message has to be transferred to anyone that enters your venue, and the manager is essentially responsible for making sure that that happens. And again, how can we do that? We need to provide signage. You can do public announcements, events, including it in your event program, for example, like I said, club notice boards, newsletters, etc. And the key message within those information methods is really that everyone is responsible for horse health at that venue, and that everyone has to take responsibility for their horses' health as well as the biosecurity. So this sheet will help you to formulate plans for information provision and how you can improve your information provision. Then once you've gone through those 8 steps, you can summarise your results using this handy worksheet. And this is an example of it completed. So you want to go through each topic that we just spoke about and decide whether you've got ideal practices, whether you're almost there, or you haven't thought about it at all. And then you want to rank the priority. How important is it? Because that'll help you to formulate your biosecurity plan, and that'll help you to provide you with an idea of where to start, essentially. So when you're developing your biosecurity action plan, you need to prioritize what you're going to do. So now that you've ranked your priorities, you may want to consider which ones you can achieve in the short and the long terms, and focus on those that you haven't thought of previously, or those that need a lot of work, and obviously focus on those that have a really high priority. So as a guide, short-term activities can be planned and conducted and completed within 12 months, so within a year. They will help your venue to comply with regulatory requirements, such as the Equestrian Australia requirements, for example. They should be financially viable, and they should fit within your venue's operations and enterprise and time commitments, for example. So they should be something that you can easily implement without having to change too much. When we think about long-term activities, these are things that are planned and conducted over more than a year. They may need additional finance or additional personnel resources. and they will enhance the overall kind of quality of service and aesthetics of your property, for example. Some key points to remember when you're thinking about all these actions, like we talked about initially, is that they need to be specific. Your actions need to be measurable. You need to be able to keep an eye on, are you achieving what you set out to achieve? So therefore, is it achievable? Are they realistic? Can you afford to do it? Is it practical? And can you do it in a timely manner? Remember that good practices are built into your normal operational procedures. They don't need to be expensive, and most of them should be easy to follow. If they're too difficult and too complex, then you know there's going to be a breakdown because people will forget to do the steps in the correct way. So keep it simple. A successful plan will provide you with a tool for continuous improvement. As part of determining if the action has been planned and carried out successfully, a monitoring and recording system will need to be put in place. And a monitoring program needs to essentially consider what it is that you're monitoring, how and where, or when and where, I should say, are you going to monitor it, and how will the monitoring take place? What records of this monitoring will be taken or made, and who's responsible for this monitoring process? This should ideally be a person that's separate or different to the person that designed the biosecurity process, so that it can be more objective. So with those things in mind and all the hard work you've done through all the steps 1 to 8, you can now decide on your short and long-term goals. When to do it, who the responsible person is, by when you would like the action to be complete, how are you going to monitor it, and when do you need to review it. So these sheets and forms are really useful to try and set out specific deadlines and guidelines for you to develop your biosecurity action plan. There's an emergency animal disease action plan that's also provided in that workbook that Julie has uploaded, and it's a really good example. You might want to develop your own emergency animal disease action plan, but this one's great. It is pretty basic, it's reasonably simple to follow, and it's only got 15 steps. So you want to have everything in place. So you want to ensure that your property identification code is always handy so that anyone can access it. You want to identify the manager and their contact information, the person responsible for actioning your emergency animal disease plan, who is your consulting veterinarian for when something happens, who's the district veterinary officer and their contact number, and then having note of the animal disease watch hotline. So these are the 15 points that you should think about when you're thinking about emergency animal disease action plan. And they're referring to livestock, but this can quite easily be transferred to horse properties as well. Again, Equestrian Queensland have got a biosecurity plan for suspected biosecurity risks, and they have a biosecurity action plan that you can download from their site. It looks like this Word document. Includes a whole lot of information about who the emergency contacts are, what their biosecurity policy is, what their biosecurity equipment is that they need to have in place, what they do when they've got sick horses, the vets, what to do when there's been a biosecurity breakdown, this flow diagram that we're going to go through, the communication plan, etc., etc. So that is ultimately what you want to try and develop for your property. So this little flow diagram is really useful because it helps you to think about processes that you might employ or steps that you might want to take if a horse at your horse event becomes ill. So who do you need to contact? Who's going to do the contacting? Do you need personal protective equipment? Where is it kept? Who's the person in charge? And then, are you going to isolate the horse or not? And if not, why? And if you are going to isolate it, where are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? Thinking about all those details. And then you need to get a vet involved. Which vets are you going to get involved? Who's going to be the person that needs to contact that vet? And who's going to be doing most of the communication? Then if that vet suspects that the horse might have a contagious disease or be a biosecurity risk, then who is going to be the person that's in charge? Who's the person responsible for working with the vet and the owner? Does, in this case, Biosecurity Queensland, or in our case, PERSA, need to be contacted? What actions do you need to take to limit the risk of a disease outbreak, for example? Once you've got a confirmed biosecurity issue, what are the control options? And have you been keeping good enough records so that you can trace horses back? So this is where that horse health declaration form type thing comes into place. PERSA will definitely be involved by this point, but you still need to think about what you're going to do should you have a biosecurity issue, because your event might need to be cancelled or seized until further notice. Then that farm biosecurity workbook also provides you with some extra forms, or some useful forms, I should say. So a visitor register, for example, and a visitor risk assessment would be really useful for horse properties. Movement records, so this is not just movement on and off of your property, but also movement of horses within a property, so that if you do have a disease outbreak, even if it's just the common cold type of disease, you know, a respiratory virus, you can kind of figure out where it's come from and what's gone wrong where, so that you can continue to improve your practices. And then you also want to obviously keep husbandry records. So this includes any treatments, whether that be veterinary or supplements, farriery, dental care, or any other interventions. Very good. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that Julie may have picked up along the way.